In previous lessons, we've learned about Darwin's evidence for species change. He laid out this evidence in his famous book on the origin of species. We've also learned a little bit about the story of vertebrates, the evolution of vertebrates from non-vertebrate ancestors. In this lesson, we're going to combine the two. We'll look at the evidence for species change as it pertains to vertebrates. Now, we've seen this tree diagram before, made by Ernst Haeckel some time ago, but we're going to use the evolutionary tree here to represent the vertebrate part of the tree of life. And on the left, then, the root of the tree would be some ancestor in the past, and as we move up the diagram, we're moving through time towards the present. And you'll notice then the tree is branchy. Now, the branchiness of the tree illustrates the formation of new species over time from common ancestors. And here's a simplified view of that on the right, where we have an ancestral species splitting into two new species. So where do species come from? Darwin said they come from nearby pre-existing species. Now we've mapped out some of the details of the vertebrate tree of life here. We have fish and amphibians and reptiles and mammals and birds. And now we're going to start to look at the categories of evidence that Darwin collected in his book as it relates to the vertebrate story. So first, what we're calling Exhibit A is going to be the fossil record. And we've seen this diagram before, that the fossil record shows the emergence of new vertebrates over time. From the ancestor, the common ancestor of all vertebrates would have been the fish. They were the first vertebrates. So in the oldest rocks, the only vertebrates are fish, and in younger rocks we have fish and amphibians, and then the younger rocks, fish, amphibian, reptiles, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and then we find the birds. Now let's use our evolutionary tree to help us understand why do we get this pattern of fossils in the rock layers. Well, let's consider this rock layer right here, fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal. Well, that would be like we were finding a rock layer at this time on the evolutionary tree. So we're going to have fish, we'll have amphibians, we'll have reptiles, and we'll have mammals. But notice there will be no birds found in this rock layer, no fossilized birds, because birds only evolved at a later time. If we look at those younger rocks, we will find bird fossils, because now we have the fish, amphibians, reptiles, but we now also have birds and the mammals. So the pattern of the vertebrates in the fossil record can be understood by this evolutionary tree over here, where new groups of vertebrates came into existence over time. And again, if new groups of vertebrates evolve from pre-existing groups of vertebrates, we should predict transitional species. For example, between fish and amphibians or reptiles and birds. And in fact, the fossil record supports that. So Tiktaalik is a transitional species. Has fish-like characteristics, but also amphibian-like characteristics. As well, Archaeopteryx is a transitional species, having dinosaur characteristics as well as bird characteristics. In the case of Tiktaalik, this creature had scales and fins and gills like a fish, but then it also had a lung, it had a rib cage, it had a flat head with eyes on the top, it had a neck, it had sturdy bones in the fins, and these are characteristics of later amphibians. And with respect to Archaeopteryx, so some dinosaurs were evolving feathers and wings, and Archaeopteryx clearly shows this mix of characteristics. So we've got wings and feathers like a bird, and then we've got teeth and a tailbone like a dinosaur. So this is Exhibit A, where the fossil record supports Darwin's claim of species change. Both the pattern of vertebrate fossils over time as well as the existence of transitional species. Now let's move on to another category of evidence for Darwin. We called it Exhibit C, comparative anatomy, where you compare the anatomical structure of different species. Well, vertebrates are what scientists call tetrapods. They have 4 limbs. What's interesting about those limbs is that there is a common pattern of bones in the limbs. There's one upper limb bone, and then 2 lower limb bones, and then a bunch of little bones forming sort of a wrist, and then digits. Now, why would that be the case? Well, Darwin's going to argue it's because the common ancestor had that pattern of bones in the limbs. And we were just discussing the emergence of limbs from fins, from fish fins, in a transitional species of Tiktaalik. So it was creature like Tiktaalik, where the fins were evolving into limbs, that whatever that bone structure was in this common ancestor, then it would be passed on to future vertebrates. Now this picture down here shows one of the larger Tiktaalik specimens that were recovered, and you can kind of see this pattern of 1 bone, 2 bone, and digits. So while Tiktaalik had these front fins, the fins were really sturdy fins. They had a bone structure that is starting to resemble the pattern found in later vertebrates. So evolution can make legs. In this case, fins evolved into limbs. But while evolution can make legs, evolution can take them away as well, as we see with the later evolution of whales. Now here we see the story of whales. At the top we have the ancestor of whales. This creature lived on land, but near the water, but it had 4 limbs. But over 50 million years, that ancestral species underwent significant change. And this change is well preserved in the fossil record. For example, as we go from the top to the bottom, we see what's happening to the limbs. They're getting smaller, and in fact the rear limbs are disappearing, and the front limbs are turning into the fins of a whale. And a lot of that change happened within the span of 10 million years. The drastic reduction in the rear limbs and the front limbs evolving into fins. In fact, in many whale species today, inside their body they have a tiny pelvis bone and a hind limb, and it's within the body. It doesn't even stick out. Now this is what scientists today call vestigial structures, and Darwin understood the importance of these structures. What does vestigial mean? It's a characteristic that is not functional in the current species, but was functional in the ancestral species. So the existence of vestigial structures was a challenge to Christian thinkers. Why would God make whales with these little tiny bones that don't do anything? Well, Darwin had an answer, that they are vestigial. They did have a function in the ancestor, but over time, evolution modified these creatures for life in a new environment, the oceans. Now let's consider another example. Here we have the evolution of birds on the dinosaur branch of the tree of life here. So dinosaur limbs were evolving into wings. Well, just as we saw with legs, so too with wings. Evolution can make wings and take them away. Consider the Galapagos cormorant. So this species of cormorant is found only on the Galapagos Islands. They have wings, but they can't fly. In other words, here's a part with no purpose. And again, for Darwin, this was a challenge to Christian thinkers. Why would God make this bird species with wings that don't work? How do we understand that? Well, Darwin's answer was that these wings were vestigial. They were functional in the ancestor species, but evolution modified that species until we see these non-functional wings in the species today. Here we can compare the skeletons of a cormorant species with the power of flight, and here's the Galapagos species on the right. First, the one on the left. Look how big those wing bones are. So this is a powerful flyer, and the keel here, this is a ridge of bone to attach large flight muscles. We can see that is absent in the Galapagos species, and the Galapagos wing bones are just much smaller. So the Galapagos species has lost the power of flight. And Darwin's going to say, well, the Galapagos species today had ancestors that could fly. In fact, that's how they got out to the Galapagos Islands. A cormorant species flew out to the Galapagos Islands and in the last several million years evolved into the flightless species we see today. So this shows us that evolution is just operating within a given context. In the past, dinosaurs evolved wings. Natural selection favored the construction of wings in that particular species, in that particular evolutionary context. But here on the Galapagos Islands, natural selection favored the destruction of the wings, the reduction of the wings to the point where the wings don't work for flight. It all just depends on the evolutionary context. Using our bracket diagram to show natural selection, here we would have the ancestral species down here on the lower left with functional wings. So this would be a South American cormorant species that flies out to the Galapagos Islands. But now the idea is every generation there's variation, and the winners in the struggle for existence in this case have smaller and smaller wings. Now, why was that the case on the islands? Well, it turns out there were no predators on the island. So, of course, birds use their wings to fly away from danger, including predators. And if there are no predators, then you don't need wings for that purpose. But then why would the wings get smaller? Well, it turns out the way these birds had to make a living is to go back into the ocean to feed underneath the water. And in that situation, it's beneficial to have smaller wings, so you have less drag when you're swimming under the water. So here we have it then. Because there were no predators, there's no penalty for reducing the size of the wings until they don't work anymore. And furthermore, there's a positive advantage to having smaller wings because then you're a better swimmer underneath the water. Finally, let's note that the Galapagos cormorant is a nice example of the formation of a new species from a nearby pre-existing species. And that, of course, was the South American cormorant. And most of them stayed on the continent as South American cormorants, but some made their way out to the Galapagos Islands, where the different living conditions favored different kinds of adaptations. In this case, the reduction of the wings to become vestigial structures. Now let's move on to another category of evidence for Darwin, and that was classification or groupishness. So here we see our 5 vertebrate classes here. So why is it that we can group these species based on similarities? So the idea is that vertebrate species can be classified in groups based on the time since a common ancestor. So take these 2 species up here, very close on the branches there. Well, any 2 species with a recent common ancestor are going to share many traits. There hasn't been much time for evolution to equip them with different adaptations. But if we compare them with, say, 2 species that are farther from each other on the tree, well, they're going to have a more distant common ancestor. So with a distant common ancestor, they're going to have fewer shared traits, since there was more time for differences to evolve in those species. So the reason that species, in this case vertebrates, can be grouped based on their similarities has to do with the time since a common ancestor. And now let's combine sort of comparative anatomy with classification and make the following observation. You see, take the mammals up here. Well, mammals tend to have these characteristics. They produce milk and have fur. And of course, the birds have the feathers and wings. And the reptiles have dry, scaly skin, shelled egg, internal fertilization. And the amphibians, they're tetrapods, moist skin, they have lungs. And of course, the fish have fins and a backbone, etc. Well, why do these groups of vertebrates have these different sets of adaptations? So the explanation is that the groups of vertebrates share sets of adaptations because they share common ancestry. The adaptations of the common ancestor are often passed on to the descendants. So the reason why the vertebrate groups share these characteristics is because the common ancestor had those characteristics. Now, why do these vertebrates have different sets of adaptations? Now, that has to do with their evolution through time. So as vertebrates expanded into new environments, group-specific adaptations evolved to survive in new environments. So we saw this diagram in an earlier lesson. So let's start down here with marine fish. As some of those marine fish, so those are saltwater fish, moved into freshwater habitats, new sets of adaptations evolved. And then we have some of those fish evolving limbs with which to move on to land. So we have those adaptations of amphibians. And then we have new sets of adaptations evolving in reptiles that allows them to live disconnected from water. And then we have new sets of adaptations evolving in the mammals to allow them to live in cooler climates and other diverse habitats. And then we have sets of adaptations to conquer the air. So the reason that the different groups of vertebrates have different sets of adaptations is because we're seeing the movement of vertebrates into new environments. And they're evolving new sets of adaptations in response to the particular environment in which they're trying to live. So again, just to recap this, why do the different vertebrate groups have these sets of adaptations? Because the common ancestor of those groups had those adaptations. And why are these sets of adaptations different from those found in other groups? Because vertebrates were on the move. They were conquering new environments, and natural selection favored new sets of adaptations in those environments. Okay, so that wraps up then what we were calling Exhibit C and D, comparative anatomy and classification. Now let's move on to another category, and this will be the final one in this lesson. We called it Exhibit B, species distribution. And this has to do with the answer to the question, well, where can we find all these different species of vertebrates? For Darwin, the location of species was a clue to species origin. Now, two species with a recent common ancestor will tend to be found geographically near each other because the ancestor was nearby. And so this was a basic claim of Darwin's, that species have a single site of origin, and if new species come from nearby species, well, then new species are going to be near the ancestral species, nearby the other species out of which they arose. So the geographic location of species is going to shed light on the origin of species, claimed Darwin. And a wonderful example of this can be seen on the Galapagos Islands. So species on oceanic islands did have to make a long journey to reach the new environment, but once there, the separate but nearby islands provided new opportunities for species formation. So you recall, the claim here is that one species of finch from the continent made it out to the Galapagos Islands. But that one species of finch is going to evolve into many species of finches. Now, what triggers that? Well, we're going to have island-to-island migration. And if the different islands have different living conditions, well, then natural selection will begin to favor different kinds of adaptations to meet those differences in the living conditions. And you recall, so notice what we're doing here is if one species, colonizes, let's say, this big island here, but then fragments of the population colonize these other islands, you have the conditions for what we see in the top right here, where we're going to have the multiplication of species as one species fragments into different populations on different islands with different living conditions. But because new species are made from a pre-existing species, they're going to share many features with the ancestor species, which is why they are similar and found near each other. Now, this is why you tend to find similar species near each other, because they had common ancestors in the area. And here we see some of the different finch species, and one of the notable differences in terms of adaptations are the beaks. The beaks have different shapes, different sizes, and Darwin understood those beak differences to be adaptations to the local living conditions, the food supply on the different islands. And why are there so many new finch species? Well, there were many different and isolated island environments. If there was just one island out here and it had the same kinds of food everywhere on the island, then we would not have predicted the multiplication of finch species. So here Darwin found an important pattern as he looked at the location of species all across the planet. Similar species tend to cluster near each other. This was true in the Galapagos Islands, but also on the continent as well. Now, what would explain that? Well, for Darwin, It's precisely that new species arise from nearby pre-existing species. That's what explains the clustering of similar species living near each other. Take a look here. We have the Galapagos Islands, and then recall the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. And Darwin was very interested in comparing the species found on these oceanic islands. They were very similar geologically, same climate. The question was, did they have the same species? And the answer was no. Darwin discovered this important pattern. Species on oceanic islands are most similar to species on the nearest continent, but they're also different. And again, Darwin had to explain both aspects of that. Why are oceanic species most similar to the nearest continental species? Because it was the continental species that were the ancestors of the oceanic species. But why were the oceanic species different from the continental species? Because the migration to the islands led to the evolution of new adaptations. The island environment was different from the continental environment, and so natural selection favored different sets of adaptations to meet the demands of island life. And finally, Darwin argued that new species originate in one place, a single site of origin. And that helps us understand another pattern Darwin found having to do with oceanic islands. For example, many Galapagos species are only found on those islands. And the reason, said Darwin, is because they evolved there and they haven't yet migrated anywhere else. And this is true of other oceanic islands that are far from continents. They tend to have a high proportion of species found nowhere else in the world. And that would make sense if species originate in one place. So continental species got themselves out to the islands, and then new species evolved on the islands, and they haven't yet migrated anywhere else. So this completes then our survey of the evidence for species change as it relates to the case of the vertebrates. Exhibit A was the fossil record. Exhibit B was the distribution of species. Exhibit C was comparative anatomy. Exhibit D was classification. Today, modern biologists have added another important category of evidence that supports evolutionary change of species, and that has to do with DNA. But we'll tackle that in other lessons.